First time I met then Congressman Mike Pence was in his office. He had run a third and successful campaign in 2000, and we met in his Hoosier adorned office, and what caught my attention was hanging on the wall a no flapping picture. And then Honorable Congressman Pence told me the story about that, which endeared me not only to his faith, but his wife and their journey. He would self-describe him as a Christian, conservative, and a Republican in that order, and somewhere along the line, he would use the tagline, "But I'm not angry about it." I welcome a great friend, a great brother, and an esteemed guest on inContext. Thanks, Mike, for joining us.
Oh, it's a joy to be here. Pastor Easley, my friend Michael Easley, it's great to be in context. And let me begin by saying that whatever we were able to do in our years in the Congress as governor and as vice president is owing in some measure to the encouragement and the prayers that you and your family gave us along the way. So thank you for who you are.
Well, we love you guys, and you and Karen, and our time at the church together was a highlight for us. We still talk about those years. Lots of questions I want to ask you, but I want to start out about your faith story, because many people, they know you were raised Irish Catholic, and they know there's this evangelical Catholic collision of ideologies, and you and I both share the Catholic upbringing in parochial schools.
We did.
Tell folks a little bit about how you came to Christ and what that meant.
Michael, I feel a great debt of gratitude to the faith that my parents taught me into my life. We were a church family, grew up a big Irish Catholic family. It was church on Sunday morning, grace before dinner. But along the way, like it happens with a lot of young people, I just lost interest in faith. I was having some success in my high school years in popularity and in achievement, and I decided that God was a crutch I really didn't need. I understood why other people needed it, but I didn't. But by the time I went off to college, I had a nagging sense that something was missing in my life and in my heart. When I went off to a little college in southern Indiana, I started to meet people that they didn't talk to me about their denomination. They just said they were Christians. And they started to talk about having a personal relationship with God, which was foreign to my experience. I'd never heard that kind of language. I was intrigued. I started to show up at a fellowship group on the campus, but it would be the spring of 1978 that I traveled to a Christian music festival in Wilmore, Kentucky, at Asbury University, which has been so much in the news in the last 2 weeks with the Asbury revival that's taken place. But we traveled down there in the early days of contemporary Christian music, and I sat on a hillside. I listened to some of those early Christian artists, but it was as though, as I write in my book, it was as though I heard for the first time that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever might believe in him might not perish but have everlasting life. I remember standing up as the rain fell gently on that Saturday night and walking down at the invitation that was given from the stage. My heart was literally broken with gratitude for what had been done for me on the cross. It all came home to me. I went down and I prayed to receive Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and it changed my life forever. As you can read in the pages of that book, it was an imperfect path and frankly continues to be. I'm still a growing Christian, still learning, but I learned some hard lessons early on about my early forays in politics. I came to conclude that I'd let my ambition get ahead of my values and what I profess to believe. And so when politics came back around a decade later, we purposed to run campaigns that first honored God, treated others the way we wanted to be treated, stood for values more important than our own election. And the Lord honored that approach through 12 years in Congress, 4 years as governor, and 4 years as your vice president. And so I was doing a book signing at the Billy Graham Library not long ago. My friend Franklin Graham, who I deeply admire, introduced me, and he said, he didn't say my testimony was in the book, So Help Me God. He said, this book is a testimony. And I said, boy, that really blessed my heart. The title of the book is So Help Me God. The last three words are Thank You, Jesus. I hope all the listeners to inContext know that this is our story, but I hope they also sense it's really a story filled with gratitude about God's grace in my life.
Well, and I appreciate it, and I did not know the details of the second campaign. You write about that, and you actually put some of the information in the appendix about your speech after that campaign. But I want to jump to some other issues because, Mike, our country is, and I've said it from our pulpit here in Nashville, I don't recognize our country anymore, Mike. And I think a lot of Christians who, for lack of a better explanation, have over the years supported conservative candidates and felt betrayed and left behind or taken advantage of. We don't have to go down those roads in too much detail, but I'm 66 almost, and I look at my peer, and there's this disappointment with all things political, and our country is in such a mess. And it's like, why? And we look at our younger generation that has completely different worldview because times have changed. So let's start with this question. How does former Vice President, former Governor, former Congressman Mike Pence tell people to keep having faith in a system, even as believers?
Well, it's, we live in a very challenging time in the life of this nation. But I must tell you that I think our politics are more divided than ever before. But, Michael, I'm not convinced the American people are as divided as our politics. I tell people, once you get 15 miles out of Washington, D.C., people in this country actually get along pretty well. I mean, people have diverse views. But what we have in the saddle in public life, in our nation's capital and many state capitals around the country, is a secular philosophy of the radical left that presses against what I believe are the values of the overwhelming majority of the American people. I can tell you, during my 20 years of public service, my opinion of the national government went down. But my opinion of the American people went up every single day. This is a great country filled with people that are principled, dedicated to family. It's a nation of faith. I'll be this weekend at the Conference for Samaritan's Purse. Karen and I volunteered some time with this great ministry. You've been involved with them before. I mean, to see the way Americans will, jump in the car and drive to natural disasters and pour out their hearts, work 20 hours a day to help people they've never met before and will never see again, rebuild their lives, all in the name of Jesus. That's who America is. And my line always is, we just got to have government as good as our people again, meaning government that shares the values, the ideals of the American people, but also government that shows the kind of civility and respect that the American people, I think, in the main, show each other every day. So I'm very optimistic about the future. I think there's big change coming, but I think to encourage your listeners, I'd say look more at the people of this country than those that are governing them, and you'll never fail to be inspired by America.
I have fought this, carefully from the pulpit, and when my brief time in Chicago and even here in Music City, I tell people you're voting for policies, not personalities. You're voting for your children and grandchildren, which sounds cliche, but now that we're grandparents, your worldview changes. I mean, you write about that in your book a tad, but when you hold that first grandson or daughter, it's like Howard Hendricks said, grandchildren are God's reward for not killing your teenager. Is that you understand the joy of this next legacy, and there's nothing better. And yet we go, what are we giving them? I personally, Mike, feel like I'm somewhat culpable for the state of the country. I don't beat myself up, but I feel like we didn't do well as leaders, as parents, as influential positions of power, we might say, in the economy of power. Somebody I know preached a sermon at Moody Bible Institute called Jesus and the Economy of Power. But anyway, this whole notion of, I don't know how to navigate it. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but if I turn on anything that gives me the highlights of the political arena today, it's very discouraging.
I understand that, but I just have to tell you, I was traveling around the country over the last 2 years, and I never fail to be encouraged when I'm out with the American people. There's a love of country, there's a love of God, there's a love of neighbor that's out there. I just think in the days ahead, and you said you weren't going to ask about it, but I get asked about it every day. Karen and I are giving prayerful consideration to running for president in this next election. And one of the ways we get encouraged is that people say, well, we really love the policies of the Trump-Pence administration, but we also want to get back to a politics where people can clash on ideas, but then go sit down together and talk about their families and find ways to have principled compromise. And there's probably no area that I think about more in that area now that we've won an extraordinary victory for life, a new beginning for life with the overturn of Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
The cause now is a return to the American people, to the states, and I'm supporting efforts to advance life everywhere. But this issue of the national debt, Michael, I will tell you, when you talk about grandkids, we just had 2 granddaughters in 2 days. We have a 2-year-old granddaughter, so we got 3. We're incredibly blessed. It's, as I wrote in my book, Karen and I figured out we actually had kids to have grandkids. But today we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy, which is unsustainable. The last time that happened was when Americans were coming home from fighting and winning World War II. According to CBO and the most responsible estimates that are available, that national debt will grow by another $120 trillion in the next 30 years. And the reality is that if we don't act now to deal with common sense and compassionate reforms of programs like Social Security and Medicare, if we don't offer the kind of reforms that will set those programs on a fiscally responsible but compassionate direction, we will bequeath to those 3 grandchildren of mine an unimaginable debt crisis. And if we wait to deal with it till then, they'll only have bad choices. Yeah. They'll only have bad choices, either doubling middle-class taxes to pay for it or literally cutting programs that people depend on. We don't need to do either one of those things right now. And I know I read an article today that said that Mike Pence was jeopardizing any potential future because he's talking about the fact that we've got to reform entitlements and set our country back on a policy of fiscal restraint. But, you know, when I wrote that essay, Confessions of a Negative Campaigner, after I lost those early campaigns, I write about it in So Help Me God. I said that campaigns ought to be about issues that are more important than your election. And whether we emerge in the race for president or whether we're simply a voice, on behalf of those 3 little granddaughters and every one of this rising generation, I'm going to continue to be a voice for us doing our part in this generation. And let's be clear, you don't have to make any changes to people that are retiring in the next 25 years. You could leave that alone. But by making and offering changes for people never at the point of the need, never anybody that really needs the support, responsible, common sense reforms, you can set those programs back on a sound fiscal policy. But it's going to take leadership to do it, and that begins with being straight with the American people. But I love where you're at, Michael, because it ultimately, we've got to speak to one another as Americans about the moral obligation that we owe our kids and our grandkids. And we got to meet that. We got to meet that obligation.
I mean, it's a softball question for a conservative Republican who's not angry about it. What's the rationale behind any politician that just spends and spends and spends and spends and writes blank checks to issues that are there's no accountability for the money we gave away under either of our current administration's gigantic gifts, much less Ukraine, which I don't really need to talk about, but when you're doing that versus an unsecured border versus a unsustainable, shutdown ramifications, unsustainable cost of living for people today, inflation, and just from a pure, not even Christian viewpoint, but how do these organizations and politicians just go, it doesn't matter, just write more checks? What's the thinking in your mind?
Well, I think there's a lot of long-term thinking on that. I mean, John Maynard Keynes was a famous economist in the 20th century who basically argued that deficits and debt are a good thing, that when the government borrows money and spends, that it supports at a certain modest level that government spending can impact the economy. But again, I go back to, we have a national debt the size of our nation's economy right now, which is about to increase by a factor of 5. And nobody's talking about it. And I just think I really do believe that the time has come for us to have a real conversation, but to speak to people, the way you do so often throughout your career. I mean, it's talk about clear principles, but speak about them with deep compassion. I love the Bible verse says, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have in our faith, of course, but do so with gentleness and respect. I really do believe the American people are prepared to deal with some of these intractable problems that we're facing at home and abroad. They'd like to see our politics return to what we had back during, you and I are old enough to remember Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill.
Yep.
They used to fight, clash, hard knuckles, call each other out in public, then sit down at a negotiating table, get a deal done. And in their case, they actually extended the life of Social Security and Medicare by 50 years with a few modest reforms, changed that by 2030, the retirement age will be 67. That was phased in over 50 years. But it was responsible work that was done on a bipartisan basis. That only happens, I think, if you return to the core ideals of having politics that people treat each other the way they want to be treated, right? It gets back to the way Americans fight. I think in Nashville and in Indianapolis, people of diverse views get along pretty well most days, and because Americans are very respectful people and they're generous to a fault. And I think we'll get our politics back there someday soon.
When you and I first met, we were talking about you making speeches on the House floor about pro-life as a very young congressman. And I remember watching your career when you went to Indiana under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And then now we have you mentioned it, but the Obergefell and Hodges, and then the Roe v. Wade, quote, overturn. So let's talk about these moral issues for just a moment. We've always valued life. You and Karen fought, that a Downs child does not deserve to be aborted because he or she has Downs. In fact, I was reading that chapter and I stopped to think about all the couples Cindy and I know who have Downs kids, and they are, without exception, delightful, loving, some of them hysterical human beings that, play their role in such, they play us is what I mean, with their humor and wit, and they're productive. They can hold down a good job. And to a couple, setting aside medical challenges when they're small, it's like the delight of the family.
Right.
And so this is not talked about, but to take these moral issues and put them in sort of a group, as a politician, how important is it for, and especially the generation you or I are looking at, let's say the 30s and down, to understand what, quote, we fought for, where we are now, and why these things are still so important, Mike?
Well, because we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's no more important issue than the right to life. And I must tell you, Michael, if the Lord called me home tomorrow, I would count it among the great privileges of my life to have played some small role in an administration that appointed 3 of the justices that overturned Roe versus Wade and gave us a new beginning for life. Now I've said many times at pro-life gatherings in the last year, we haven't come to the end of the cause of life. We've come to the end of the beginning. Right. And it may take as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law as it took us to overturn Roe versus Wade, which was a half century. Yeah. But the cause of life, I think, speaks to the character of the nation. I think a nation can be judged by how it deals with its most vulnerable, the aged, the infirm, the disabled, and the unborn. And to have been some small part of that is a great joy to me. And religious liberty, I will tell you, we were in those fights a decade ago in the state of Indiana. Those fights have gone national, but I want to assure all the inContext listeners and viewers that we have a strong religious liberty majority on the Supreme Court of the United States. I have every confidence that this majority, this court, will uphold the inalienable right to live, to work, to worship according to the dictates of our consciences. And those 2 principles alone go to the very core of the American experiment. It's not lost on me as a student of history, or lost on you, Michael Easley, that the pilgrims that came to this country came here for religious freedom. It was our first freedom. And other than life, there's no greater cause than religious liberty. And we preserve those principles and ideals in the life of the nation. America will find its way through these large challenges, I have no doubt.
If you can, give me some rapid fire answers to these.
Yeah.
One major lesson Mike Pence has learned.
I have a fundamental distrust of my own ambition. I do. I wrote that.
Nor have
book.
you lost your sense of humor.
I was at a book signing the other day, and a guy said, You know that Mike Pence wrote this book because no politician that wrote a book would ever write that. But it's true. If you read this book, I love the old saying that there's two kinds of people in politics. There's people that are called and people that are driven. And Michael, you and I have known each other long enough. I've been both. In the early days,
Sure.
my first two campaigns, I allowed my political ambition to get ahead of my values, ahead of the way that I carried myself as a follower of Christ. But for us and for our family, the last 20 years, it's been about trying to discern a calling. That conversation that you and I had back in 2015.
Many times.
We're going through the same process now. We're just trying to discern, what would the Lord have of us now? And we think we get that from studying His Word, through prayer. We get it through godly counsel. In multiple counselors, there's wisdom. We get it by looking at circumstances outside our control. And so we're reflecting on all of that. But that's probably the biggest enduring lesson that people say to me, well, it matters what you want. I said, well, that's not from that day in 1978. For me, it matters what He wants.
How many times someone has told me that? What do you want? Okay, one do-over and or one regret.
I wish I joined the United States military when I was a young man. I remember I was a senior in high school, and my dad, who was a combat veteran from the Korean War, came home with medals he put in the drawer, never talked about. I grabbed a few brochures, told my dad I want to join the Marine Corps. For reasons I understand better as a father, my dad looked at me and said, look, if something was going on, you'd have my full support. But he said, why don't you get your college degree and then you can go do that. And I just never got back to it. But I have to tell you, as a father of a United States Marine, as the father-in-law of a Navy pilot, and as someone who, as a congressman, as a governor, as a vice president, has had the privilege of spending a lot of time with the men and women of our armed forces, including downrange in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I regret that I didn't take that moment in my life to put on the uniform and serve. And when I talk to young people, I'll be speaking to some friends here in town. I'm going to stop by a high school group in about a week. I try to encourage them all the time. I said, look, if you've got a heart for service, one of my do-overs, of many, it's not the only one, but one of my do-overs would be, boy, if you want to serve this country, why don't you start by going ahead and putting on the uniform of the United States?
Yeah. Well, you and I have so many friends in D.C., and those were some of the most precious years for Cindy and me, and we all fell in love with the military. And I know your close friend and mine, Captain Tom Joyce, what a rock star who never talks about himself, but it's those kind of people we got to rub shoulders with, and like, goodness, these are the finest people on the planet. Okay, we got to keep moving.
Your listeners and your viewers wouldn't know that you were actually a pastor to some of the senior leadership at the Pentagon when you were at Emmanuel Bible Church in Washington, D.C. And
it's a great
they
time.
all still cherish you and appreciate your ministry to this day.
One greatest joy.
The day
and it can't be grandchildren. You can't say grandchildren.
No, I won't go with that.
Because that's a given.
I think other than that day in 1978, the greatest joy in my life was the day that Karen Whitaker said yes. She's really the star of So Help Me God. I hope people, when they read my story, they know it's our story. And
yeah, we see a picture of her when she's really young. Go, why'd she marry Mike Pence?
It's a really good question.
one wish for every American.
It's just faith. I tell young people all the time who might have an interest in politics as well, I say, take this time in your life to develop the qualities of the inner man and the inner woman that'll make you into the kind of leader that the American people need. And chief among those things is if they haven't made time in their life to reflect on what our founders believed about a creator, that they would do that. I would hope people would find faith. And I also hope people would hold on to faith in this country. What you see on cable TV, what you see in the national government, the disappointment of public people and policies that are advanced by the radical left, I just hope they don't confuse those things with the vast majority of the American people. This is a great, good, principled, compassionate, courageous country. I just encourage people to find time in their life to nurture their faith in God and never give up on the American people.
How do you stay faithful when you have faced some of the worst onslaught from public criticism, from characterization from the far left, if you want to call it that?
I'm as human, maybe more so than the next guy. So I can't say to you that it occasionally doesn't singe. But I think for us, for our family, it's about serving an audience of one. It's what we try and do. I used to say when I was in Congress, a lot of people come to Congress and they try and figure out, what they should do, how maybe it would benefit them or their political interest the best. I always tell them, just vote right and go home for dinner. Just do what you said you were going to do. You said at the top of the program that I've often said back in my radio days and throughout my career, I'm a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. I've tried to live out those values to the best of my ability and keep faith with the promises I made to the American people and to God, and trust Him for the balance.
You have been betrayed. You've been mischaracterized. You've been slandered, whether it was when you were in Indiana or as the vice president. Let's say what you just responded is a great answer, but go a little deeper with me. Because people watch that and they go, I would never want to be a politician because of that. I would never want to step into leadership because of that. You are human. We're all human. We all get hurt. In your book, you wrote on a note, I'm tired of politics. I just want me back. Yeah, I think the average American we're talking about understands that, Mike. But when you've been that mischaracterized and slandered, and who was it? Was it Roosevelt that said Washington, D.C. is the kind of town, if you want a friend, you better buy a dog? Was that Roosevelt?
Yeah, it might have been Truman, but I'll take your word for it.
Truman, yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know. You're the expert, not me. But, so what do you do with the deep slander, the deep mischaracterization? And there are some egregious things you and Karen endured when you were in Indiana. I'm
a lot more patient about the arrows when they come my way than when they come my wife's way. My wife was teaching at Emmanuel Christian School in our third year in the White House. And I'll never forget being more surprised when a left-wing group started to attack my wife as second lady for teaching at a Christian school that held to Christian biblical principles. And we called them out. We called them out hard on it. I accused the network that put people on the air of religious bigotry, and they backed down pretty quick. But it got my Irish up. I'll be quite honest with you. My wife's an incredible person. But, I write in the book, and the title of the chapter, which I had fun titling, is simply entitled Blessed. And I talk about the fact that for some reason there's been this unusual preoccupation by some on the American left with my Christian faith. And it came into high relief when I was at the White House. But I think that it's a good place to just go park on those verses that you preach so well. But, when people speak woefully against you, you're blessed. So we try and put it all in that camp. And also, I have the great benefit of having been around this a while, having spent a lot of time with a lot of Americans. And I'm always heartened when I'm reminded that the criticisms can come. But throughout my career, I've also learned that sometimes those criticisms give evidence to a whole lot of other people that share our worldview and give some evidence to them that we hold those views sincerely. I'm always struck as I'm traveling around the country how many people would stop me and simply say, I'm a Christian too. I just want you to know we pray for your family. And sometimes I think we forget the fact that we're defined by our admirers, but maybe almost as much by our critics, that people look on and they see, if someone's criticizing Michael Easley because of the strong and unprincipled biblical stand he takes, there's a whole lot more people standing out there saying, maybe I'll go to that church. That's a pastor that actually preaches the whole book. So those are the things that we try and remind ourselves of. All people are created equal, but not all are treated equally. And that cuts both ways, because those of us that are on the conservative right, let's say, just use that category, can be as unkind to those who hold different views, and those who are in your, when you're attacked by, this very loud, maybe minority margin, where does that play? And you talked about Tip O'Neill and Reagan. I remember that as well. And I remember I think they dined together frequently, as well, if I remember correctly.
Think we can ever get back to that?
I do. I'm very optimistic about this country. I have seen the goodness and the generosity and the principle of the American people. I've had the privilege of traveling the country, traveling the world, spending time with Americans. This is a good and great nation. And I think someday and someday soon, we're going to have government as good as our people again, because the challenges are that real. I mean, the rise of China in the Asia Pacific, the new aggression of Russia in Eastern Europe, the threats to our most cherished ally, Israel, with an increasingly menacing Iran. I mean, the world needs America to be strong. The world needs America to put our fiscal house in order. And America needs, once again, to be a beacon for life and liberty in the world. And I think the American people facing those great challenges are going to rise up and give us a new generation of leadership that will meet those challenges. Sometimes it's darkest just before the dawn, right, Michael? I have a feeling that the season we're passing through right now the clouds are going to part, and we're going to see a new day for America and a new day soon. So help us God.
Thanks for your friendship. Thanks for your faithfulness. Thanks to Karen and your kids and grands. And Cindy and I love you deeply and pray for your protection. The book is So Help Me God by Mike Pence. It's just become available. You can get it anywhere books are accessible online. You should pick up a copy. It's a big read, but just take your time and flip around in it and see what areas strike your interest. Former congressman, former governor, former vice president, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael Easley. We appreciate you. We admire you greatly. Thanks for being a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And thanks for having me on inContext.
Did you know that inContext is fully funded by our listeners like you? If you are a regular listener, would you consider giving a one-time or perhaps monthly donation? You can give at michaelincontext.com. inContext is produced by Hannah Seymour, mixed and mastered by Sonomorphic, and music composed by Tycho and Blair Masters.